Well, is it always easy to trust God? No. These past 2 years have been crazy in all sorts of ways. Even apart from the pandemic, which has turned everything upside down, many of us have had an incredibly rough time with a whole lot of things to deal with. The loss of family and friends, sickness, plans just upended left, right, and center. And just the uncertainty that comes with whatever version of lockdown we're in, or what that allows, or just everything seems upside down. And even if it isn't suffering or trauma per se, that uncertainty just isn't comfortable, and it just isn't easy to live with. We're constantly living with that at the moment, and to be honest, planning for the future can actually be quite overwhelming, just with the way that things are. We sang just a moment ago, I know that you'll do it again, for your promise is yes and amen. God, you do great things. And I don't know what things you're hoping for, what you're hoping that God is going to do, what is God going to do in your life, what the desires of your heart are saying, and what they're calling out for. But do we believe those words, that God does, that God will do, that God can do great things even in the midst of such uncertainty and such weirdness? Is it always easy to trust God? I mean, let's be honest, not always. So we're in this series at the moment, One Big Story, where we are looking at the whole Bible over 10 weeks. And one of the things that I said last week is that I'm hoping that you'll see not only that it's a story, not only that it's a really good story, not that it's just the story, but that it's our story. That it's your story. It's not just a story we read or that we learn about, but it's a story that we live, that we're a part of. And at this point in the story, one of the things that is going to come to the fore, one of the things that we're going to be thinking about today, is thinking about what it might look like to learn to trust God. So let's look at the first bit of the story. We're going to look at another creation. We saw last week how the Bible story is about glorious beginnings, the shame of sin, the consequences of being sent into exile, and the question of what could make it all okay again. We began with the land in its not yet state, in tohu vavohu, wild and waste, non-functional, uninhabitable, and we began with that, and over the course of the narrative, over the course of the first chapter of the Bible, God brings it to order, and He caps it off by blessing His creation, by blessing humanity, and giving them the commission to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and to subdue it. And then at the end of creation, He blesses all of it when God rests from His work of creating. But it didn't last. Adam and Eve believed the lie of the snake. They ate from the tree, and they were exiled from paradise and from God's presence. The story repeated itself in Genesis 6. God decreated, sending it back into its non-functional watery abyss, the tohu vavohu that it all began with, and then recreated out of that. But it ended with another fall and another exile, this time in Babylon, or Babel. But out of the ashes of that story, we have a new creation. So the words from the first reading that we looked at. Yahweh said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you, and I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." In some ways, what we have here is a little replaying of Genesis 1. We have the same concern here with land and blessing, which we saw were big themes in Genesis 1. It gives a nod to the commission given to humans in 1:28. Adam was told to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the land and subdue it, and to rule over creation. And God promised Abraham here in Genesis 12 that He will bless him, and that he'll be a conduit of blessing to the other peoples of the earth. Later in Genesis 17, God makes a covenant with him and says, I will multiply you exceedingly and I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. And this is reiterated again toward the end of Abraham's story in Genesis 22. And we see the same sort of language crop up again and again as Genesis continues. Stay in this land for a while. Is that what you've got here? No, sorry, I should have been changing slides and I wasn't. Anyway, there's the commission. And there's Genesis 17. Here we are. Stay in this land for a while, and I'll be with you, and I'll bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees and my instructions. This is a promise that God is making to Isaac, to Abraham's son. And then it crops up again when Isaac blesses Jacob. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you have become a community of peoples. May he give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now reside as a foreigner, the land God gave to Abraham. And then God later makes the same promise himself. He makes this promise to Jacob. So he says, I am Yahweh, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. One writer talks about this as the first Great Commission, which is repeatedly applied to humanity. And for Abraham's family, it begins with this promise. Land, descendants, and blessing, which the rest of the Bible story will be spent working out. It isn't spelled out in chapter 12, but as the narrative goes on, we learn that God made a covenant here with Abraham. We'll have more to say about the idea of covenant as we sort of spell that out and what that looked like for the nation of Israel in weeks to come. But for now, we can think of it as a sort of two-sided relationship where there are expectations on both sides. There are certain boundaries, certain things that both sides agree on for the relationship to work. God has made these three promises: land, people, blessing, and Abraham is called to trust and to obey him. One problem. Sarah, his wife, can't have children. And without that, the promise sort of falls flat. That's how they're introduced, and very often in the Old Testament, the way the characters are introduced gives us a clue to what their story might be about, or what some of the major issues in the story might be about. Later in chapter 12, God shows Abraham the land that he's going to give him, and he says to him in verse 7, to your offspring I'll give this land. That's a bit of a problem if you can't have offspring. And although we see in the narrative how we sort of see how Abraham can be a blessing to other people in the narrative, it's really as he has descendants and starts to become a nation, and particularly in light of the commission we see in Genesis 1:28, that the idea of blessing and being fruitful and multiplying kind of go hand in hand. All of it comes down to then the promise to have descendants. The story also ends with Abraham being buried by his kids. Spoiler alert, he ends up having kids. In between, God appears to Abraham 8 times, and although he talks to him about other things like inheriting the land in chapter 15, every single time there's at least some reference made to Abraham having descendants, or the promise that God has made for Abraham to have descendants. Not just in and as it goes on, with each one of these encounters, it gets more and more specific. Abraham will have descendants, not just in his household, but he'll have biological descendants. Not just biological descendants from him, but from him and Sarah. So it kind of gets more specific as the promises go on. But the question hanging over this whole story, especially in light of the beginning, that we know that Sarah can't have kids. Will Abraham trust God? It does say in 15 verse 6 that Abraham trusted God and that God counted it to him as righteousness. And when God did call him to leave his family and head off to the land that he would show him back in the beginning of the story, Abraham did do that. So he does have some faith. But he did also take his nephew Lot. And that seems to be excluded by the whole idea of leave your family and go to the land that I'd show you. He takes Lot along with him, maybe as a bit of surety. Yeah, sure, I'll believe you as you have made this promise to me, that you'll give me descendants, but in case it doesn't work out, I want to have somebody in my household here to kind of stand surety. And then when they are so abundant in their wealth, their possessions, their herd, their flocks, the land can't actually support them together, so they part ways. And what does Abraham do? Well, he makes his servant, Eliezer, his heir. Again, sort of as an act of surety, taking out some surety. In chapter 15, he and God talk about this, and God makes it clear that it'll be through one of Abraham's own sons that he'll keep his promises. But even after that, as we'll see, Abraham isn't quite done making his own arrangements. Abraham's faith is real, but it is a little bit double-minded. And quite often, I'll bet that that's true of us too. Abraham's story shows us that imperfect faith is still faith. What we see with Abraham is that he's taken on a journey where a lot of the time it isn't at all clear how things are going to work out. But through that process, God is working with him. He's working in him, stretching him, growing him, maturing him, refining him. And it's a great comfort to know that God doesn't choose somebody who has it all together. He doesn't choose somebody who's already a finished product to bring about his plans and purposes. And I think that's especially clear in the next bit of the story that we're going to look at. So we've seen another creation, but there is also another failure. Rather than trusting God and his timing, in Genesis 16, Abraham and Sarah decide to help God move things on a bit. Genesis 16, first six verses. Now Sarah, so actually just let me throw in there now, I'm just going to keep saying Sarah and Abraham, and maybe I'll switch to Abram and Sarai at some points. They do get renamed, and there are reasons for that, and we're not going to focus on that for now. I'm just going to use the names interchangeably, just so I don't confuse anybody by reading things wrong. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abraham, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can help children through her." Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. So Sarah took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. So Abram slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar saw that she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt. Then Sarah said to Abram, "This is your fault. I put my servant in your arms, and now she's pregnant, and she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abram replied, "Look, she's your servant. Do what's good in your eyes." Then Sarah treated Hagar so harshly that she ran away. Now, on a first reading, it's Abram and his wife making alternative arrangements to see that God's promises get fulfilled. But when we look a little bit more carefully at the details, what we see is that actually this is a replaying of Genesis 3. Sarah said to Abraham, much like the woman said to the serpent. Abram listened to the voice of Sarah, much like God observes in Genesis 3, because you've listened to the voice of your wife. Sarah took Hagar and gave her to her husband. much like the woman took the fruit and also gave to her husband. And after that, there's some blame shifting that goes on that actually is quite reminiscent of what goes on in Genesis 3, where they start pointing fingers at each other. It's the story of humanity. Now, we make bad decisions, decisions without reference to God, taking matters into our own hands, making our own arrangements as if God isn't there working, rather than trusting in His goodness and faithfulness. And how often do we do that? How often do we think that we ought to just give God a heads up on how He ought to do things? How His plan isn't quite moving along as quickly or as smoothly as it could, and maybe He needs our advice. Perhaps it's just not to our liking, and we need to remind Him that this wasn't the plan. I don't know where you're at. It could be anywhere along a spectrum of responses, but perhaps what you need to hear this morning is that God knows what He's doing, that God can be trusted, that God is good, that you don't need to keep taking matters into your own hands, and you can trust Him. Not do nothing. That's not faith, that's laziness. But maybe there are some things that are out of your control that actually you need to let go of, and to say, actually, God, I'm going to trust you. God calls Abraham to trust Him, and so far in the story, he hasn't done a great job. But God isn't finished with him yet. So the last thing I want to look at this morning is that Abraham's given another chance. In Genesis 22, God tests Abraham. He gets sent up Mount Moriah, which in 2 Chronicles, much later, is linked with Jerusalem. Just put yourselves in Abraham's shoes for just a minute. All you've wanted, your heart's deepest desire, is to have children. God has promised, against all odds, that He will make that happen, and He's made a covenant with Abraham to that effect. Finally, it has happened. He has the son that he's longed for, the child that he loves. And then God tells him it's over. You must go offer him as a sacrifice. As readers, we know at this point that it's a test. We're told in verse 1 it's a test. Abraham doesn't know this. But it does raise a question, why this test? Well, I think it's precisely because of the things that we've just been mentioning. What Abraham and Sarah wanted more than anything else was a child, and they were willing to put others, like Hagar, in harm's way to make that happen. This, along with some of the other ways that we've seen that Abraham hasn't really trusted God in the story, means that when God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, He's going straight for the issue that's standing in between He's going straight for the issue that's standing in the way of trusting God's goodness. One writer puts it this way: the command to sacrifice Isaac pulls apart self-interest and trust in God's goodness. Sorry, I actually got it there for you. Abraham must now place his hope on God's goodness, or he must make clear that in the expulsion of Ishmael, which was Hagar's son, we didn't actually cover that story, but you can read that in Genesis 16. With the expulsion of Ishmael, he was just using God as a means to a seriously wrong act, without supposing that God cared much or took much notice of the wrongness. Lydia, can you just put the slideshow back up for me? Thanks. In the end, Abraham does trust God, and in the end, God's goodness does prevail. He stops Abraham at the last minute when commitment to the decision is actually at its clearest. He provides a ram as a sacrifice instead of Isaac, and when we put the sacrifice language that's used here together with the fact that this place would later be associated with Jerusalem, I think what we have here is in seed form or a foreshadowing of Israel's sacrificial system, particularly the Day of Atonement, which we'll have more to say about in some of the weeks to come. But here we've just got the beginnings of it. It's just pointing in that direction that something is happening, that the substitution that's going on here is important and is a theme that will be returned to. It's through the covenant that God made with Abraham. It's through Isaac that God keeps his promises to Abraham. It's through his covenant with Isaac and then through Jacob, and in the weeks to come we'll see the whole nation of Israel, that God has covenanted to work out his plans and purposes, to bring blessing and abundance to the rest of creation, to fulfill that commission that we saw back in Genesis 1:28. It's this covenant with Isaac that centuries later will lead to Jesus on the cross, where we see the ultimate substitution, and where all the bad decisions and lack of trust that we have are dealt with. Where everything that stands in the way and the hurt that might have been caused from it, everything that stands in the way of a relationship with God is pushed aside. And it's a covenant that we can all be a part of, if only we'll trust him.